Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us at another AWSN webinar session. My name is Stephanie Luhrs. I'm one of AWSN's Queensland chapter leads, and I'm very pleased to be hosting what is sure to be a very fascinating session with you today about the world of surveillance and data tracking, which of course is highly topical at the moment, particularly in this post-COVID world we're living in. Now to the main event, I'm very pleased to introduce you to our esteemed speaker, Nicole Stephensen. I'm sure many of you will be familiar with Nicole's work. We were lucky enough to have Nicole present in Queensland only a few short months ago. But for those of you who are meeting Nicole for the first time, you are in for a real treat. Nicole is the principal consultant at Ground Up Consulting, a boutique firm that she established in 2011. There she provides capacity building and privacy by design services across government, industry and not-for-profit sectors. She's also the Executive Director for Privacy and Data Protection at the Internet of Things Security Institute. She is co-author of the IoTSI Security Framework for Smart Cities and Critical Infrastructure and hosts a bi-weekly podcast, Privacy Matters, that I highly recommend to you if you haven't already tuned into that previously. Nicole has nearly 20 years in the privacy profession and believes in building organisational capacity around privacy and embedding best practice into organisational culture. She's a sought after international speaker about privacy and its interface with information security and risk management, ethics and trust, and you'll shortly see why. She is a subject matter expert and guest lecturer for the DUSO Business School at the University of New England and at the Queensland University of Technology, and is also the author of the Freedom of Information and Privacy curriculum for the newly formed Canadian Criminal Justice Academy. To add to that impressive CV, she's a leading member of the International Association of Privacy Professionals and hosts the IAPP's KnowledgeNet chapter for Queensland. Prior to the incorporation of IAPP in 2019, Nicole was also a member of the International Association of Privacy Professionals at the ANZ chapter, where she sat for 3 consecutive terms on the board. In addition, Nicole lends her privacy expertise to the digital policy arena, focusing on matters affecting children and young people. She grew up in Calgary in Canada and has lived in Australia since 2003. So I think we can probably call you our own now, Nicole. I'm very pleased to hand over to Nicole to hear more about this fascinating topic. Thanks, Nicole.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for having me. It's a tiny bit weird just to see names and no faces, but I hope at the end of the session, when we're not too worried about bandwidth, I'll be able to give you all a wave and say hello in person. I see some names that I recognize, and I'm really excited that, that you're here joining us for this event today. And as Stephanie mentioned, I did speak in Brisbane, I think it was in February, and I talked on a similar topic, which was the fuss about social media. And I think now we're at that point, particularly in this mid-COVID era, that the fuss about surveillance is a really timely topic. Now, because I'm sort of a bit tired of COVID talk, everything being about the pandemic, I think it is important to broaden the discussion about surveillance to include other types of technologies and why this is an issue generally, not just during times of pandemic, but also during other times of crisis. So that's the nature of the conversation that we're going to have today. And I do hope that, that you enjoy yourselves. I hope that you have some questions afterwards. If you don't worry about it. What I've done is I've prepared a slide with some focus points. So for those who are feeling a little bit shy about asking a question directly, I have some prompts for you, and I hope that'll get the discussion going, because I do remember our February event and everybody being in the room. I mean, I know we all had a glass of wine in hand, but it was still an excellent discussion, you know, well lubricated discussion, obviously, but excellent and exciting to see so many people in the security space activating the privacy side of their thinking. From my perspective, that's always a good thing as a privacy professional, to have that level of complementary crossover. So without further banging on, I will start my presentation now to make sure that we stick to our time frame. If Stephanie, you can please just let me know when everyone's able to see my screen.
Yes, I can see it now.
Fantastic. Okay, so today we are talking about the fuss about surveillance. And surveillance is a big deal. And surveillance is one of those topics that gives many of us in the community almost a visceral reaction when we even hear the word surveillance. And I think it's really important to unpack why. So in today's session, we're going to talk about topics like tracking and tracing and surveillance broadly from a privacy perspective. We will come away with awareness about what community privacy expectations are. And I'd like you all in particular to note the sense of a power imbalance that can happen during times of crisis especially. And also, I hope we all come away with an understanding of where we have responsibilities in terms of our roles in government and industry as technology vendors, and in the case of large media giants like Google or Facebook in that data broking space. Now, there are a couple of lenses that I want to address this discussion through because I think contextually it's really important. First, it's important that all of us today understand that privacy and security are not the same thing. Now, I'll unpack a little bit more what privacy is later on in this session, but suffice to say that privacy is something very particular. It's about protecting personal information in accordance with the law and community expectations. Security is something different. Security is the fence that we put around that which we wish to protect. So in the context of, say, personal information, security is the series of controls or methods or fences that we might put around the various elements of personal information that we are seeking to protect. The second lens that I think is really important is this notion that we are fully and firmly in the fourth industrial revolution. And the World Economic Forum, who are the authors of this lovely mandala that you see on the slide in front of you, they have done a fair bit of work at identifying what cybersecurity imperatives are in the context of the fourth industrial revolution. And you'll see on this mandala that cyber privacy is one of the imperatives that flows from cybersecurity. And I think what's really interesting is that there's this interconnectedness between things like cyber privacy and the security of things. And by things, I mean, you know, the things that we might use to surveil others within the community. There's also that interconnectedness with technology and the law. And these are important to remember because when we look at the prevalence of technology and our use of technology now as a society globally, we're no longer in the days that we were when I first started out in privacy. You know, when I first started out in privacy, one of the biggest technical issues that we might have faced would have been the inadvertent faxing of a document from a hospital to the 7-Eleven instead of to the GP that the document was really intended for. That was about as scary and big as it got in terms of tech. I mean, we were talking about things like CCTV cameras, yes, but CCTV didn't yet have the ability to recognize faces. So we've come a long way in terms of our tech prevalence. And what that brings with it are privacy considerations that we can't ignore. First is that there's this rise of something called surveillance capitalism. And I'll talk about that a little bit later on. Basically, surveillance capitalism is the idea that there is data about you and a lot of data about you. And in observing you, somebody is able to make money. There is also the risk of something called uberveillance. And now uberveillance is a fairly new noun. And really what it means is this almost ubiquitous level of observation of a person from every different angle, from above, from around, from on you in terms of a wearable and perhaps even inside you. This level of observation allows for an increase in control over the human being observed. The third lens is that we need to think in terms of community expectations in times of crisis. So when we're thinking about surveillance and the issues associated with that, it's important to put into perspective that when we're talking surveillance during a crisis, like the aftermath of a terror event or a pandemic situation, a bushfire or mass flooding or some other kind of disaster, community expectations of privacy are likely to alter during times like this because that's not the primary concern. The primary concern is survival, it's safety, it's taking care of one another, it's about being healthy. Now, the community might look to government to solve or address whatever the crisis is quickly. Now, if you think about just the experience that we've had with COVID-19, how quickly governments were on to the notion of having contact tracing apps. Now, this is because the community was looking to the government to solve a health crisis, to improve community outcomes more quickly than they would if they didn't have or didn't harness technology in a particular way. Now, where I'm going with this is that there are always going to be trade-offs during times like this, where I may trade off my privacy for increased security from threats, increased safety from harm, or an increased level of assistance in relation to health services or perhaps financial help. And the last lens that I'd like you to keep in mind, please, is that technology is outpacing regulation. And the mandala that I showed you before in relation to the fourth industrial revolution really hammers that home, that we're in a place where technology is so prolific. Digitization has well and truly happened. We have a globalized view now of the world and how we do business and how we interact with each other. All of this is happening in a way that is allowing industry really to drive and propel change and innovation. And that's really exciting, except that it's also really important that we give ourselves time and space to govern for that, to make sure that we have that safety net in case something goes wrong. So where technology is outpacing regulation, what we end up having then is a degree of fear or conjecture in the community, and that impacts the community's ability to trust, whether it's trust for industry or trust for government. And in the context of surveillance, I don't know about you guys, but there tends to be a sinister kind of overtone about surveillance. We always think back, to those kind of Orwellian views of surveillance. And because of this, it's important that if the community is reacting in this way, sensing something sinister and having maybe even a visceral reaction to the idea of being watched in some way, as government and industry and tech providers, we have an obligation to make good decisions, particularly where regulation has not yet caught up with the technology. So I said before that I was going to unpack a little bit in terms of what privacy is, and I won't belabor the point because for those of you who have heard me speak before, I often bring out this slide to help illustrate that we all have a different threshold in terms of what is private for us, what we feel is private on any given day. So it's important to understand maybe what would be considered to you or me to be private. And of course, there is the privacy of our information, our identity, and what's known about us. There's also our health, our inner being, our inner wellness, our mental health, our physical health, whether or not we are in a place of disease or wellness. There's also the privacy of our territory or the space that we occupy. And that can be anything from, when we're in an elevator traveling from floor to floor, or it could be driving in our car going home from work. It can be going in our front door, closing the door, shutting the blinds, and sitting down with a glass of wine in front of the fire. These things may all elicit some sense of what we might like to keep private. And similarly, our communications, what we choose to communicate and to whom, about whom, and using what kind of method. That notion of communications privacy is also relevant for a number of people. The challenge, though, with looking at privacy in this context and how we feel about privacy is that this sort of harkens back to the days of talking about privacy only in terms of civil liberties, right? My right to be left alone, my right to feel that I'm free from intrusion or to be free from intrusion. It's hard to do something with those kinds of thoughts and feelings, and it's certainly hard to act on those things in a reasonable and consistent and replicable manner, which is why globally we are in a position now of having privacy laws almost all around the world that regulate what happens in certain circumstances. Now, most privacy laws focus on the protection of personal information in accordance with a series of privacy principles. And it's from this perspective that generally I speak about privacy, because it is able to be made sensible over time when we're able to have a set of rules or a decision-making framework that we can work with. But when it comes to surveillance doesn't always fit neatly in that box of adhering to a series of principles that everyone agrees on. Surveillance is really in that space where we as a community and even as industry or governing bodies, we have a real challenge making surveillance understandable and comfortable for the community. Now, I think here it's important to reflect on the fact that data and personal information are also not the same thing. So, often when we talk about what industry and government are doing in terms of data projects, or even things like surveillance projects or population surveillance projects, we can, as developers, potentially think in terms of, ones and zeros and things that are otherwise meaningless unless we apply them in some way. But I can say that if data is about someone, if it reveals their identity or could easily lead to their identity being known, that is their personal information. So again, when we talk about surveillance is about me. It's about my identity. It's about where I go, who I'm with, when I did it, what I bought, what I look like, whether I'm old or young, a man or a woman, whether there's some criminality attached to what I'm doing. That's all my personal information. And that tends to, again, elicit this sense within the community that there is something sinister about surveillance. Even the word surveillance tends to create a natural disharmony with the way that we would like to live and operate in society. So let's get down to the crux of it then. What is the fuss about surveillance? Well, surveillance is happening above us and around us. Think about the satellites that, orbit the Earth every 90 minutes. Think about what those satellites are looking at, what they can zoom in on, and to what degree of accuracy. Think about the CCTV cameras that we might see while we're walking down the Queen Street Mall. Think about the various safe zones that a number of cities have set up where cameras are operating 24/7 and they're monitored by someone. And yes, this is, presumably for a law enforcement purpose or to deter crime. But there's a perception within the community that that level of being watched is something that's uncomfortable and that members of the community might be being profiled in relation to. So, for example, in some cities where youths or indigenous may gather in cities, in parks, in public parks, because that's culturally something that's very important. Are CCTV cameras in that context profiling members of society? Because that's an uncomfortable thought. Also, there's this notion of data valence. That is looking at, surveilling us through the data that we generate. That's what our data broker, that's what Facebook and Google and a variety of other bodies do. That's what Axiom in the United States does when all the data that they have gets poured into a gigantic big database, and a digital twin of us can be formed based only on where we shopped and what we bought and who we talked to online and what our preferences are, what our likes and our dislikes are, and who our friends are or who our friends aren't. That's data valence. Now, surveillance is another kind of surveillance. And this one is, I mean, it's neat, but it's also kind of creepy. It's the idea that our wearables, our smart glasses or our smart watch, or perhaps even the pacemaker that we're wearing, or some other kind of implant that's connected in some way digitally to something else, that all of those things are gathering data about us and allowing something about us to be known that without the technology wouldn't otherwise be known. And finally, the totality of it all is the idea of ubervalence. And ubervalence is scary. It's, from my perspective as a privacy professional, something that's quite sinister. It makes me think of, Minority Report or 1984. It makes me think of a dystopian world as opposed to a world where, hey, we've got data about everyone and everything, and therefore we can operate in this wonderful, beautiful, harmonious way. I actually think it's different. It's a place where we're scared. We don't want to go outside. We don't want to be ourselves. We don't want to be so knowable. And there are some wonderful academics working in this space, Katina and MG Michael, and they are doing some great work in relation to ubervalence. So for those of you who are interested in knowing more, I'll make sure that I share those details following today's presentation. Now, a case in point in relation to surveillance during a time of crisis or any other time really in this case is Clearview AI. And I don't think a single one of us hasn't now heard about Clearview AI, but for those who may need a refresher, basically Clearview AI is an app that is mainly sold or marketed to law enforcement, where you can search for someone's face, a face of, say, a known criminal, by trolling through millions and millions of records that are held publicly online on social media sites. So you Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, etc. And the use case for this, ostensibly there's a good one. So in terms of time of crisis, it would be a national security use case where we're trying to ferret out those terror cells or members of terror cells within our community, and for criminal investigation generally. Now, many law enforcements have used Clearview AI on a free trial basis. And as a privacy professional, what I think is really interesting about this is that you all know when you sign up to a free trial, it's not really a contract in the sense of contracts that normally a platform provider would have to sign with a government agency. And particularly here in Australia, there are, our national privacy law as well as some of our state-based privacy laws are quite clear that when a contracted service provider engages with a government agency, that they're required to comply with privacy principles as part of that engagement. Now, where law enforcement agencies or, members of those law enforcement agencies are saying, oh yeah, I'll give that app a crack, and maybe they even use their own iPad or their own iPhone to do it, there is a real disconnect between the law enforcement purpose and even one that may be okay from the perspective of working within the privacy principles and how it's actually being done on that free trial basis. So I think that this is an important thing to note here, particularly because right now the Australian Privacy Commissioner as well as the UK Privacy Commissioner, they're jointly investigating Clearview AI, and particularly the use of it by our law enforcement agencies that for some time in the media we're saying, oh, no, we don't have a contract with Clearview AI, but many of them were using it on that free trial basis. Now, the thing about Clearview AI is that it allows users to upload a photo of a person and then match it to photos that have been collected from the internet, right? So a public place, public photos. But this crosses a creepy line for those of us who are not criminals, but are part of this larger pond from which, you know, images are being fished. And the idea of scraping from social media platforms and websites, it does tend to cross that creepy line because it's not within sort of an ordinary community member's reasonable expectations that what they think they're doing as part of their private life, even though it's in a public space, is now open and accessible for law enforcement purposes. Now, a second case, which is interesting, and this relates directly to the time of crisis that we're in, is the epidemic investigation support system that was created by South Korea. Now, the use case here was COVID-19 contact tracing. And awesome system if you think about the ability to very quickly and accurately contact trace for COVID-19. What's interesting here, though, in terms of function creep is that you have a number of different systems that are put together in order to fulfill this purpose, which creates like a giant surveillance database relating to the community. It's things like taking your personal location pings from your mobile phone or within the apps that you use on your mobile phone, and that's a type of surveillance, and it takes that and then matches that information with your credit card data, another type of surveillance that tells us where you were, when you were there, and what you purchased. Now, again, contact tracing, awesome. You can probably find a person in the community really quickly using this epidemic investigation support system. But there is a risk, and that's that we're profiling members of the community, or potentially we are, based on the picture we form of them in relation to those combined data sets. So, what happens if the contact tracing purpose isn't the only purpose? What if the picture being formed about me also says that maybe I'm up to something that the government doesn't sanction as being appropriate for someone within that community? So there can be some adverse outcomes for people as a result of being surveilled in this way, even though ostensibly there's a very strong public purpose. These outcomes can be things like separation from friends and family, segregation within the community, the goodies and the baddies, the ones that behave and the ones that don't, and also lost access to services or income. Now, what's interesting to note about this example is that I'm coming at it from a particularly Western perspective, right? I can't help it. I live and work in a Western democracy. And it's important, I think, for us all to keep in mind that depending on where we're looking in the world, the concept of surveillance and the concept of the community being regularly and routinely observed by government is not something that makes the community uncomfortable. It's part of the community's expectation in their interaction with their government. So this is something to think about in terms of surveillance. If we have a differing expectation within the community about privacy, does this then impact the way that we design and deploy and regulate our technologies? What I'd like to impart today, though, is look, if we want to deploy surveillance technologies, whatever they are, right? They could be things like CCTV cameras embedded with facial recognition. They could be RFID-enabled implants, so like your pacemaker, for example. And they could be the watches, the wearables for monitoring Alzheimer's patients in terms of how they move around their care facility. The technology could be something bigger, like a community surveillance system that's established using a satellite. It can be surveillance through location tracking or tracing. And the point here is, if we want to deploy these kinds of technologies, we need to design for privacy. We need to think about privacy at the outset, even in a time of crisis, so that we can have better outcomes for our community. So this means then, and especially in terms of times of crisis, that our governments, our industry, and technology vendors should be observing the privacy principles when they first decide on this great new idea in terms of community surveillance. And they also should be responsive to community privacy expectations. If I feel that I shouldn't be surveilled during certain times or when I'm doing certain things as a member of the community, it's important that my government knows that and understands that. So how do you get it right in a crisis? Well, I looked to the Canadians recently because oftentimes when it comes to privacy and best practice, they are on the forefront. So it was a Canadian called Dr. Ann Cavoukian that first coined the term privacy by design way back in the 1990s. And privacy by design is now found in privacy laws and best practice globally. So hey, you would think that during COVID-19, for example, you might turn to the Canadians for some good advice. And I did. I looked to the Canadian Privacy Commissioner, and they did a fair amount of work around, well, how do we get surveillance right in terms of contact tracing in a time of pandemic? So this being the crisis at hand now. And they set out a number of principles that our decision makers should use before developing and deploying whatever the particular technology is. And I really think that these principles can be taken and extrapolated across a whole variety of surveillance technologies, not just the ones that are topical in the media right now. So let me step you through them. It's important before you develop your surveillance technology, and certainly before you deploy it, that you identify your legal authority to collect and use and disclose personal information. Now, oftentimes what this means is that there's going to be a law somewhere that says you need to do this in order to fill a particular public purpose. So in the context of contact tracing applications, for example, many countries around the world, including Australia, have embedded the requirement for doing this within their legal frameworks. It's also important, though, to consider the reasonable expectation of privacy that the members of the community who will be surveilled are going to have. So in the circumstance, would they consider this level of surveillance reasonable? You know, so again, in a post-terror event, do we consider it reasonable to have increased surveillance in our airports and increased checking of passengers? Most individuals in the community would say yes, because they don't mind being looked at if it means that that one person that's from a terror cell that may be in the airport could be apprehended. It's also important to look at the additional public sources of information that might be available. So not just the circumstance that we're in, but are we taking information from anywhere else and combining that information with what we gather through our surveillance technologies? Necessity and proportionality is important as well. It's the idea that before we go and deploy surveillance technology to do a thing, whatever the thing is, have we sat down and thought about, is this really necessary? Is this proportionate to the issue that we have at hand? So in the context of contact tracing for COVID-19, you can definitely establish the necessity of contact tracing. Now, is the use of technology or an application in this case proportionate to the need? Well, certainly decision makers around the world are saying, well, yes, it is. Not only is it proportionate, but it's faster than our traditional means of methods of contact tracing. To ensure, though, that your measures are necessary and proportionate, you need to have some kind of evidence on which you're making your decisions. And you don't want to go overboard. So you want to make sure that your purpose is narrowly defined. So if you think back for a second about that South Korean example that I gave you, the contact tracing purpose of having this great big giant community surveillance database is clearly established. But if there are other government purposes for which that information might one day be used, someone's going to have to decide whether those things, whether those purposes also fit the bill. Now, and in a Western democracy, I would say probably they would have some challenges doing that. Now, purpose limitation is directly linked to the principle before. It's gather personal information through surveillance technologies, we're doing it for a specific and limited purpose, and we're not going to then use that information for some other purpose. So, you know, I don't want my information that's gathered through, say, a contact tracing application, or even, you know, social media scraping for, you know, some other reason. I don't want life insurance sold to me on the basis of that information. I don't want to be marketed to, and I certainly don't want a notation made in my health record without my knowledge or consent. It's important that where we're using surveillance technologies, if there is an ability to de-identify the details of the individual before we use the data, we should do that. The reason for this is that oftentimes what we need are statistics and patterns and various other things that we can measure about what's happening in the community. And we have to surveil the whole community to get that information. But do we need the community to be known on an identifiable level? I'm not always so sure. It's important too to consider the impact of surveillance on our vulnerable populations. So, you know, think about what surveillance is used for, right? Other than the observing component of surveillance, it's also used for sorting. So we sort adults from children, we sort old people from young people, we sort criminals from law-abiding citizens. It's important when we're using surveillance to sort for whatever purpose that we avoid profiling vulnerable members of the population. So an example would be, you know, people of a particular gender or gender identification. That kind of sorting might be more sensitive in that case. Also, you know, any algorithmic decision-making or artificial intelligence, depending on how we set up our surveillance tool, it might actually contain biases that could create a disproportionate impact on members of society. Openness and transparency is key. It's probably the most important of all of the principles from my perspective when it comes to surveillance. And this is because there's a direct connection to the community knowing what you're doing, the community knowing what is happening in a particular case. So the idea that if we decide we need to deploy a particular technology for a particular reason, have we notified the community about that in some way? Do we have a banner on our website? Is there a newspaper article or a television ad about it? Or have we done, you know, a stock standard old-fashioned privacy notice? These are important things because if the community doesn't understand why we have decided to use surveillance in a particular context, it creates that creepy factor. It creates that feeling of oppression or some kind of sinister motivation on the part of our government or our industry. Just a quick note about open data. Surveillance technologies have the potential to gather huge amounts of data, very identifying, meaningful personal information about the community. And it's important that if we're going to then dump that information into some kind of open and accessible format, that we have to weigh the benefits and risks of releasing certain data sets. And so this kind of goes back to the idea that if you can de-identify it first, so much better, because there are huge risks of creating erroneous conclusions about members of the community or sectors of the community based on data sets that are made public. You know, you look at location data, for example, mobile phone pings. They don't actually really tell us anything unless we're looking at those pings in a context. But if the context itself is erroneous, if the investigation is in some way flawed, you can then come up with flawed conclusions. And oversight and accountability is also important. Now, the reason I say this is because whenever we're going to roll out a technology that's huge, whenever we're going to roll something out that is screening and observing and surveilling the community, it's incredibly important that someone's looking at that. Someone, a regulator, is saying, okay, that may not be appropriate in a circumstance. Somebody is holding those who are using the technologies to account. Now, this is all fine and well, right, to get it down on paper. And I'm all for having oversight for surveillance technologies, whether it's CCTV or mobile phone tracking, whatever it is, privacy law, other legislation. But if it's there, and then you have a privacy regulator who hasn't been given any money in order to enforce that, it's sort of not, it's nonsensical, right? It's written down in the law somewhere, but there's no way of ensuring that people are actually following the rules. And finally, time limitation. So surveillance is an area where, because of the creepiness from the perspective of the community, and because of the risk of function creep and additional things happening with the information that's outside of the purpose for which it was originally collected, it's really important that we place time limits on it. So in a time of crisis like COVID-19, when we've rolled out these contact tracing apps, this is a really good example of, okay, well, COVID-19 is not going to be here forever, and we're not going to, well, it may be here forever, but maybe not in the same level of social impact and health impact. It will be very important to have an end date for when those government-sanctioned contact tracing apps are rolled back and that data is deleted because it's no longer necessary. Now that concludes my portion of the presentation, but what I'm really interested in is finding out what all of you think about surveillance, what you think about it in the, the bigger academic sense, what you think about it in terms of civil liberties or the socioeconomic impact of using these kinds of technologies. And because I know in a webinar setting, particularly people can become a little bit nervous about talking and sharing, I've created a slide with some discussion points that I hope will allow that chat window to start filling up so that we can have a really great conversation as we close out today's session. Thank you all so much.
Thanks, Nicole. I actually have a question just sort of around the social media scraping topic. I mean, I think personally, I accept the arguments against, the concept of is privacy dead. I find that I'm constantly choosing between the convenience of using an app or Google Maps, or with the knowledge that my data is being collected. Do you have any comments around how individuals can sort of balance that and what practical steps they may be able to take to sort of assess that a little bit further themselves?
Look, I think this is kind of a two-part answer, right? First, I would like to impress upon everyone here that privacy is not dead. What privacy is more important than ever. And it's important to understand how privacy operates in our new world context, right? So if you think back to the slide that I shared from the World Economic Forum and how everything now is digitized and interconnected, it's really important to be aware of who we are in that space, and that so much about us, our identity, our patterns and our preferences drives what's happening in the world now, in terms of the world market, in terms of the kinds of services and benefits we might seek from our government and so forth. The thing about social media scraping is that it seems to be, from a privacy perspective, a bit of a stretch, an overreach of what government would ordinarily do in terms of intersecting with a person's private life. And I won't say that I'm opposed entirely to the idea of social media scraping. I'm not opposed entirely to the idea of law enforcement accessing public information, that's available through social media like Instagram or Facebook or YouTube, where there's a legitimate public purpose for that. So a good example would be, in India, they have used social media scraping to find children that are missing or potentially being exploited, and to remove them from harm. Now, I think that that's a really great opportunity to use social media scraping for a strong public purpose. And, you know, in our privacy laws worldwide, there's usually an exception to the rule around, you know, how we use and disclose personal information where there is a public health or safety need, or where there is an ability or a requirement to address the imminent physical harm or harm to life of an individual. So in that case, I can see social media scraping being useful and valuable. I think what needs to happen, though, in terms of government's interaction with the community is to say, hey, the technology is available to us now. So when you're conducting your private life online in public spaces and you haven't locked down your privacy settings, your feeling of privacy or your feeling of not being observed may change. You may be intruded upon by the government in particular circumstances. I hope that answers your question, Stephanie.
Thanks, Nicole. No, that was excellent. Thank you. We have another question here via the chat group. The question is from Cav. Is it legal to use social media scraping for open source intelligence purposes?
Sorry, I was on mute. Is it illegal? I think that is it illegal or is it legal?
Legal.
Legal. Well, I can't say for sure whether it's legal in all cases. What I can say is that if something's open and it's in the public domain and you go and you have a look at it, that is open source intelligence gathering at its finest, right? That's what intelligence experts do. Whether they use a suite of materials for scraping those social media platforms, and whether they do that using a company like Clearview AI, for example, whether that is legal is something that is up for debate worldwide now, and it's certainly something that's being talked about in terms of whether or not it crosses the creepy line.
Okay, we've got a couple more questions, Nicole. I think you've kickstarted a very interesting topic here. A question from Marie. Am I correct in assuming that social media scraping would only collect your publicly available information? So if you have your privacy settings locked down, your private information won't be scraped?
Well, Marie, you'd like to think so, but there has been some analysis done of those social media scraping applications and also the social media providers themselves, whereby there are in some cases agreements between those providers with the apps or platforms that offer social media data, you know, for a fee. Whereby some of the information even the information that might be locked down in your private settings might become available in certain cases. So as a privacy expert, I'm not really on social media that much, but I'd be saying I'd be very, very careful about what I put there. If I was someone who was worried about having my personal information made available for whatever reason outside of that, you know, that private reason.
I think just off the back of one of your earlier answers, Nicole, from Claire, should it be up to the individual to set their privacy settings, or should it be up to the government agencies to do the right thing, or should the responsibility rest on both?
Claire, it's a tricky topic, this one, because I oppose any kind of commentary that suggests for even a moment that the community is 100% responsible for knowing all the ways that it must protect its privacy. I think where industry or government are collecting and accessing our personal information, there is also a strong obligation there to ensure that that's done in a fair and reasonable way and in accordance with the privacy principles. So, you know, the community looks to government, the community looks to industry to set the benchmark and to do the right thing and to serve us. I mean, you think about what government is the public service. And when you're in the public service, it's about taking care of your community and doing the right thing by them, as opposed to you know, only doing the right thing when someone asks a tricky question. So look, long answer made a bit shorter. I think there are obligations on both parties, but I would say because the power is balanced in favor of government and industry players, it is they who have the greatest degree of obligation.
Thanks, Nicole. Another question from Va. She says, agree, absolutely. I can't see that those are vulnerable understanding that landscape. Nicole, I had a question just sort of relating to privacy by design, just more broadly, and what your views are about organisations really investing in that, particularly at the bigger end of town, but also in the SME space. I mean, what are organisations doing? Are they taking it seriously now, and particularly in the current climate?
I don't think they're taking it seriously enough, Stephanie, but I think it's starting. Right? I think the place that we're at in terms of the fourth industrial revolution, in terms of globalization of markets, in terms of the amount of data that is being used as currency worldwide, we're in a position now where I think companies will fail and governments will find themselves in strife if they're not designing for privacy at the outset. And it's important to remember that designing for privacy doesn't mean keeping everything private. It doesn't mean designing for a person's absolute right to privacy. What it means is designing systems, technologies, programs, projects, etc., in a way that's responsive to community expectations and in a way that's responsive to the privacy principles that have been established globally for some time. So it's the idea that we make privacy a central and important and primary consideration for how we do our business or how we govern in our society. And that's different from the absolute right to privacy. It's about doing the right thing and striking a balance and increasing trust. And I would like to see many, many more agencies doing that. One space where I think it is becoming increasingly relevant, but still underdone, is in that local government space. And you know, in your intro, you mentioned that I am doing some work in terms of smart cities and critical infrastructure. And what I find is that smart cities can't actually be that smart if they're not designing for privacy. If they're developing or buying and deploying technology without considering the community they serve, that's not a smart city, that's a tech-enabled city. And those are two very different things.
Thanks, Nicole. I think that's the last of our questions, unless anyone wants to quickly add one to the chat group or even via video. Okay, I think we'll close the session. Thank you very much, Nicole. That was fascinating, and I think you well and truly debunked that old adage, privacy is dead. We'll close the session. Thank you everyone for your attendance today, and we look forward to seeing you at our next virtual session next Tuesday. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.